Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Russell Lord. I'm the curator of prints, drawings, and photographs here at NOMA, and I'm honored to welcome you all here tonight for this lecture in conjunction with our presentation of the exhibition Louise Bourgeois Paintings. I've had the great fortune to work on this show here at NOMA, but even greater fortune to have worked with our distinguished lecturer tonight, who I'm delighted to introduce in a moment. First, I want to thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. Thanks to all the docents who are here, a number of whom I know are going to be touring the show, so they'll be paying attention to Claire's words very closely. I also just want to thank Marie and Harvey Orth for their support of the show. Thank you very much. And also Mike and Amy Siegel, who have joined us tonight. We're also very happy to be joined by Maggie Wright, the executive director of the Easton Foundation, who's here with us tonight. The Easton Foundation is the Louise Bourgeois Foundation, and without their participation, the show would not have been possible. So thank you all for coming. And now it's my honor to introduce Clare Davies. Clare Davies is Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She joined the Met in 2015 as the museum's first curator in her department with a specialization in art from the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. Over the past 7 years, she's built the foundations of the Met's collection holdings in this area, acquiring major works from across the region. Prior to her appointment at the Met, she served as associate curator of the Townhouse Gallery in Cairo, Egypt, and completed her doctoral dissertation at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. Among the many exhibitions and projects she has organized are the first U.S. retrospective of Iranian-American artist Sia Armajani, titled Sia Armajani, Follow This Line, at the Met Breuer and the Walker Art Center in 2018 and 2019, as well as an exhibition in 2021 of works by Masoud Arabshahi, Faramars Pilaram, and Ardashir Mohassis, all of which have been gifted to the Met in recent years. She was a co-curator alongside Kim Benzel of the exhibition Rayan Tabet, Alien Property, 2019 to 2021, an exhibition which dealt with questions of provenance and the history of museum collecting in the Middle East. And she is currently at work on a future installation of the work of Maha Mamoun. But perhaps most importantly for this evening, Clare Davies is also the curator of the first comprehensive exhibition of paintings by Louise Bourgeois, titled Louise Bourgeois Paintings, which opened at the Met in April and is currently on view upstairs here at NOMA. It has been a privilege to work with Clare over the past year to bring her excellent work on this great artist to New Orleans, and it is my honor to welcome her here tonight so that she can share some of her insight with all of us. Please join me in welcoming Clare Davies.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me here today to speak about the work of Louise Bourgeois and the exhibition that is currently on view. I wanted to begin by thanking Susan Taylor, the Montine McDaniel Freeman director of the New Orleans Museum of Art, as of course you know. Without her, this exhibition would not have come to New Orleans and would have been much poorer for it. Also, thanks to Lisa Rotondo McCord, Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs, and my collaborator and co-curator, the wonderful Russell Lord Freeman family, Curator of Photography, Prints and Drawings. Connor Kellyan worked with me on setting up this evening's event. Connor is the Public Programs Coordinator. Laura Pavanelli and Jenny Daniels were also instrumental in making it happen. So thank you again for being here this evening. It's special to be in New Orleans because this is a city that Louise never visited until much later in her life, but from the moment she landed in the US, it sort of represented to her a point of reference or a sort of imaginary home base in that it combined French culture and American culture, especially American folk culture, in a way that she could relate to very much. And it was also a place that she was introduced to perhaps through the photographs of Charles Laughlin, who some of you might be familiar with. And I think there's something a little bit of a cheeky surrealist game at play as well, in the sense of Louise, Louisiana. So in many ways she tied, though these are imaginative ties, they're ones that I think were real to her and manifested in her using a number of references to New Orleans and the city in her work, especially in her early work. So before to continue, so for most people, the name Louise Bourgeois, the now iconic French-American artist, conjures visions of large, leggy spider sculptures titled Maman, one of which you can visit right here in the gardens of the New Orleans Museum of Art. Others may think of what one critic termed the curiously eviscerated objects that help shape the American artistic post-minimalist landscape of the 1960s and 70s. Bourgeois was adopted as an icon of second-wave feminism by artists in the early 1970s who translated the title of 4 of her paintings, Femme Maison, into Woman House, for their own landmark exhibition in LA. And some of you may be familiar with that project, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary. Since her breakthrough exhibition organized by Deborah Wyatt at the Museum of Modern Art in 1982, major exhibitions around the world have dealt with, it seems, almost every aspect of her practice, including extensive bodies of works in print and textile and her writings. This evening, however, I'll be focusing on a little-known aspect of her practice, one largely unfamiliar, I've found, even to many of her closest friends and supporters. Specifically, I'd like to explore Bourgeois' relationship to the collection of drawings and prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I discovered in looking through her notebooks from the period, served as an important resource for the artist as she developed her first mature body of work, one that would help establish many of the best-known motifs and themes that recur throughout her decades-long practice. Between 1938, when Bourgeois arrived in New York, and 1949, the artist created well over 100 paintings. The Runaway Girl may be the first painting that she produced after leaving her native Paris. In this work, a young woman appears in profile with long blonde hair. She hovers mid-stride above a flat, watery blue expanse. A small suitcase in her hand is shown in perspective. A home is just visible in the background, a nondescript swimming figure in the midground, and a seawall of razor-sharp rocks in the fore. A wispy cloud appears top and center. The painting subject is characteristically entangled in the artist's own biography and state of mind, while also being uncharacteristically explicit about that fact. Bourgeois presents herself suspended in time and space, traveling between one continent, culture, language, stage of life, and another. For Bourgeois, it seems, ambivalence was an attitude and aesthetic with roots in both personal and collective experience. The Runaway Girl serves as a way into Bourgeois' complex and often cryptic body of painting, which has until now remained largely out of sight. The woman in profile, the home, the cloud, these will all serve as recurring motifs in the paintings that Bourgeois produced in this period. Areas of raw canvas and charcoal sketches compete with paint on the work's surfaces. A shallow sense of depth is created in the layering of washes or areas of color through which graphic underdrawings come in and out of focus. The subtlety of these surfaces of her paintings means that the experience of viewing the work in person rather than in reproduction can be revelatory, and I certainly recommend that you go and take a look at the exhibition after this. The painting's composition also resonates in later paintings by the artist, characterized by an emphasis between figure and ground, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Bourgeois met the young art historian Robert Goldwater in Paris in late 1938 after he wandered into the small print shop that she ran out of a room in her family's tapestry gallery. Couple of months later, the two were married and on their way to New York City. Over the next decade, Bourgeois found herself at the center of the wartime city's heady artistic milieu. Many of the leaders of the European avant-garde sought refuge in New York around this time, including André Breton, Max Ernst, André Masson, Hedda Stern, and the anti-retinal artist Marcel Duchamp. Due in part to the arrival of these exiles, American artists such as Jackson Pollock, Arshile Gorky, and Mark Rothko, many of whom were themselves originally émigrés who had worked in a representational mode for the Works Progress Administration's federal art project during the late 1930s, famously began to experiment, increasingly using a non-representational approach to art making, whose specific formal and conceptual contours would remain hotly contested in New York throughout the 1940s and 1950s. And this is, of course, what I'm referring to as the New York School. While Bourgeois exhibited regularly alongside prominent members of these artists in exile and the emerging New York School, her work remained largely illegible in their midst. This was a deliberate choice on the artist's part. Bourgeois recorded her immersion in the New York art world in her diaries and notebooks from the period, which contain a wealth of now familiar names, references to exhibitions and social gatherings, lunch and dinner appointments. Meanwhile, she largely spurned the purest dictates of abstract painting that were emerging around her. In contrast to the all-over paintings of her contemporaries, her works tend to emphasize illusionistic representations of space using one-point perspective, rather than prioritize the flat surface of the canvas. The relationship of figure to ground is central to most of her works. Even her most abstract compositions retain a certain anthropomorphism and a trace of narrative. Similarly, she eschewed painting's place at the pinnacle of a hierarchy of artistic media, even as she embraced it and worked in it. Drawing, weaving, print, and 1946 sculpture alongside painting were all media that she worked in this period. And often she worked in more than one medium at the same time. And yet, Bourgeois' paintings are also palimpsests of artistic influence, crisscrossed by her wide-ranging and in-depth and up-to-date knowledge of art history and practice. While impossible to enumerate here in full, some central points of reference for the artist included 16th and 17th century French tapestry, Art Deco, constructivism, 19th century French fine art prints, surrealism, modernist architecture, and, yes, the New York School. It would be a mistake, however, to attempt to draw a straight line from one of the visual motifs or artistic concerns she developed at this time to any single point of origin. Even as the number of references latent within her work multiplied, she honed a circumscribed visual lexicon and painterly logic that was entirely her own. The research I undertook in 2019 and 2020, this was a COVID baby exhibition, in preparation for this show, was a thrilling experience. While the world outside seemed to be falling apart, I was thumbing through the artist's notebooks and agendas from the 1940s. They took some time to absorb. I began picking out mysterious strings of numbers that I couldn't correlate to anything else. Eventually, I recognized these as acquisition numbers linked to the holdings of the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Met. It was there I discovered that Bourgeois had repeatedly sought out European Renaissance approaches to defining, measuring, and depicting the natural and man-made world. And here's a wonderful example of 2 pages in her notebooks, and you can see that she's both writing the titles and dates of, and even the page number in one case, of some of the sources she's referencing, and also doodling from those, directly out of those. So you'll see here some of the references that she's looking at. Bourgeois gravitated towards certain kinds of material. For example, she was particularly interested in expositions of one-point perspective, what we might call a centuries-old technology of image making that produces the illusion of depth on a flat surface. She consulted 15th and 16th century treatises on architecture, landscape design, and astronomy. She was fascinated with Renaissance illustrations of certain scientific or technical devices. One of these is the Ludian, also known by the wonderful name of clepsydra, which translates literally as water thief. And I think this central image is an example of that. The clepsydra, was a mechanism used to demonstrate various scientific principles related to the displacement of fluid. Similarly, Bourgeois was drawn to explications of ancient timekeeping instruments, such as the sundial. And this is something I will focus on for a moment. I was left wondering, looking at these notebooks, what linked the artist's mysterious and compelling, surrealist-inflected paintings of the 1940s to her interest in the non-artistic, technical imagery of the Renaissance. Two aspects of her painterly practice seem especially significant in this regard. First, how Renaissance technical illustrations of one such device, or the vertical sundial, informed the artist's development of what I refer to after Bourgeois as abstract figures, or the elongated, anthropomorphic, and vertically oriented floating forms in the center of her canvases. Second, the visual lexicon developed in Bourgeois' paintings intersects with the concept of the acéphale, or the headless human figure, promoted by renegade surrealist photographer Georges Bataille in the 1930s. Bataille adopted the acéphale as an emblem of the anti-modern, inverting the terms of a Renaissance humanism organized around the promise of scientific and technical mastery of nature and humankind, as embodied in Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, from circa 1490, and I'll loop back to that in a moment. While Bataille celebrated the emancipatory potential of the headless figure, Bourgeois appears to have been both disturbed by and drawn vertiginously towards his critique of the modern. The motif of the clock first appears in Bourgeois' work of the 1940s as a cipher of the artist's personal and domestic life. Hours populate her diaries from the period, marking the time of gallery openings, rendezvous with friends and associates, and notations of her young children's schedules. A small painting on wood, not shown here, titled Little Boys, No More Food After 4, from around 1945, addresses the artist's three young children directly, referencing Bourgeois' parental role as timekeeper. Another work, an assemblage from 1944, titled Le Train de 8h47, recalls the frequent train trips that Bourgeois and the rest of the family took back and forth from New York City to their house in rural Easton, Connecticut, which is where the Easton Foundation borrows its name from. In this work, 6 denuded clock faces, embedded in the surface, serve as a mute, handless witnesses to their own ineffectuality. In this period, Bourgeois began to draw on illustrations of the montre solaire cylindrique, or vertical direct sundial, an example of which you'll see here. And this is one of the sources she was referencing or referring to in the Met's collection. She referenced these to fashion the abstract figures that inhabit many of her paintings from the period. Bourgeois' notes from the period suggest multiple sources, possible sources for this imagery. For example, an entry devoted to the vertical sundial in a late 19th century history of timekeeping devices, referenced in the artist's diary, offers the following description. Quote, "It is composed of a cylinder upon which are engraved vertical lines that intersect with other diagonal lines arranged in a spiral. The hours were indicated by the shadow of a horizontal arm, metal arm. The technical term for this arm is the NOMA, a Latin word meaning one who knows or examines. An interesting metaphor, I think, for the role of the Renaissance man in the context of a body of work that consistently places ambiguity and ambivalence at its center." Mathieu Planchon, the author of the book I just quoted from, points out the presence of the suspended vertical sundial in a number of well-known portraits of real-world, quote, Renaissance men, including Hans Holbein's The Younger's portrait of the famed mathematician Nikolaus Kreutzer from 1528. So here's the vertical sundial, as well as a portrait of the astronomer Johann Neudorfer the Elder and his son from 1561, as well as Joost Amman's woodcut The Astronomer from 1568. In contrast to these portrayals of famous Renaissance humanists surrounded by scientific tools with which to accurately and objectively describe the earth and sky, Bourgeois' own self-portraits portray a very different kind of figure, one who inhabits a world resistant to the heuristic potential of Renaissance science and technology. Bourgeois' painting, Southern Scene, 1947, borrows and transforms various elements of the illustrated sundials that the artist identified in these sources. The form in the foreground of the painting is based on the vertical direct sundial described by Planchon. The vertical lines and the spiral typically inscribed at a diagonal angle around the exterior of the device's cylinder have disappeared, replaced by a series of horizontal rings. Likewise, the sundil's protruding gnomon resembles a human arm that ends in a series of finger-like barbs suggestive of a hand. Maybe a little bit difficult to see over here, but this is on the left, this curving line up here. The arm curves dramatically upward in a gesture that echoes in early self-portraits featuring a girl in profile, such as Portrait from 1939, as well as in her works in her Femme Maison series from 1946 to 47. The cylindrical form in Southern Scene wears a cone-shaped hat topped with a small sphere, a detail that appears to have been transferred faithfully from the 16th century sources the artist consulted. A taut line extending from the ball on top of the cap also suggests that the artist was familiar with the practice of suspending the vertical direct sundial. Finally, what appear to be legs extend to the edge of the painting, where they end abruptly, footless, a detail that heightens both the form's anthropomorphic appeal and its sense of suspension. Bourgeois would later retitle the painting Abstract Figure, drawing our attention to this form occupying the foreground of the work. The juxtaposition of the terms abstract and figure claim a certain hybrid nature and suggest a reconciliation of the dominant binary opposition shaping artistic discourse and practice of the time. And the abstract figure appears in many Bourgeois paintings from the late 1940s. While the eponymous work incorporates references to the direct vertical sundial most explicitly, Bourgeois soon stripped this motif of much of its original specificity. Its cap and the attached string from which it is hung disappear, while the sense of suspension remains. The cylinder thins into a pole. I'll give you an example of what I mean. If the diagonal spiral that encircled it no longer exists, the entire form appears to spin. The number of arm-like horizontal projections multiply. The more familiar horizontal sundial also features prominently in paintings from this period. The most legible instance of this motif appears in this untitled painting from 1947, in which a horizontal sundial tipped at a 45-degree angle toward the viewer has been integrated into another anthropomorphic vertical form. A series of dots partially ring the edge of the dial, and an elongated lozenge-like shape appears to strike its surface at an angle, evoking the rays of sun on which the device relies to function. In Untitled Red Room, 1947, an abstract figure emerges from the center of a horizontal sundial composed of 6 elliptical forms arranged at regular intervals on the floor. It appears to turn as it casts a shadow across the surface of the dial. Similarly, this is another one. Similarly, an untitled work from Bourgeois' largest known painting incorporates imagery from both the abstract figure and the horizontal sundial. Most of the paintings by Bourgeois featuring abstract figures set their subjects afloat within narrow architectural spaces where they are hemmed in by 3 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. This piece is appropriately titled, "It is 6:15." The appearance of floorboards below and sometimes above indicate a space defined by one-point perspective, guiding the viewer's eyes into the interior and toward a central point of convergence in the background. The use of one-point perspective in these works would seem to enforce its main function, or what Carol Armstrong has described as the rationalization of sight, the unification of legible action, and the controlled framing of the human histoire. However, the claustrophobic shallowness of her paintings, which often resemble a diorama or a shop window, appear to undermine this attention to perspective. Beginning in the late 1940s, Bourgeois translated the abstract figure's most salient qualities, its precarity, its suspension, and sense of centripetal movement its precarity, suspension, and sense of centripetal movement and its position inside an architectural structure from the painting into the space of the studio, gallery, and even stage. The personages, or vertical anthropomorphic wooden sculptures that she produced between 1946 and 1953, and of which this is an example, fourth wall of the painting. And with the paintings of abstract figures trapped between narrow walls, Bourgeois originally intended to exhibit the personages in a claustrophobic, quote, claustrophobic space such as the top of stairs under the roof, or, quote, in a closet which is in effect the way they were conceived. Likewise, some of the 3-dimensional stage props she created in 1951 for a dance performance by Eric Hawkins at the Judson Memorial Church clearly draw on the attributes of the abstract figure. The stage upon which they would have appeared calls to mind the proscenium-like spaces that dominate works such as Bourgeois' early untitled painting, 1940, or even abstract figure. While many of Bourgeois' paintings are clearly in dialogue with surrealist artists such as Max Ernst or Giorgio de Chirico, her status as an ambivalent modernist draws her closer philosophically to figures such as Georges Bataille. Derived from the Greek word meaning headless, Acephale was the name of a secret society founded by Bataille in 1936, as well as a journal published between 1936 and 1941. The journal's cover featured an illustration by Masson based on Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. He is headless and holds a flaming heart in one hand and a dagger in the other. His intestines are visible, and a skull appears in the place of his groin, a totem of the stridently anti-rational nature of the project behind the journal and secret society. For Bataille, the head represented the social hierarchies and conventions imposed on modern human experience and the claims to rational thought and objectivity, or institutionalized religion that capped them. To, quote, lose one's head in this context referred to a move away from these constraints and a return to the primacy of the senses and an ecstatic experience of the sacred. The latter Bataille associated not with the evolved or vertical man, but the animal on all fours, whose head and genitals, aligned with reason and basic instinct respectively, share the same horizontal axis. The 4 paintings, and this is the best known of those 4, constituting Bourgeois' Femme Maison series, are among the few paintings by the artist that have circulated widely. They merge the lower body of a nude female figure with a series of structures, including a New York apartment building, a home resembling the artist's childhood residence at Choisy-le-Roi, in this case, a white clapboard home, and a neoclassical Jeffersonian courthouse, an architectural type common in the southern US. The hyphenated conjunction of femme maison, which translates idiomatically as housewife, and literally, as I've mentioned, as housewoman house, echoes the hybrid figure structures that appear in so many of her works. The purest and most sinister presentation of the latter appears perhaps in an untitled work from 1946, featuring what appears to be a gallows with a shadowy human figure floating or suspended beneath. In each of the 4 works, parts of a woman's nude body are painted with various building types, and I refer now to the femme maison: a childhood home, a clapboard house, a New York apartment building, and a courthouse. Art historians have cited multiple art historical references that may have informed the series of femme maison, including the surrealist game of The Exquisite Corpse, Masson's mannequin with a birdcage over her head, and Ernst, The Attirement of the Bride, 1940, works in which the woman's body forms a hybrid with something that has replaced her head. However, it is not in any single work so much as the broader surrealist concept of the acéphale, I would argue, that resonates most powerfully across Bourgeois' paintings. In a diary entry from September 17, 1947, Bourgeois noted, "Take femme sans tête to Rainford, Place Leprosarium, Louisiana. Rainford takes picture of half woman." So this is kind of what her style of writing in these notebooks is. And she's referring to Percy Rainford, who was a good friend of Duchamp and contributor to surrealist publications in New York at the time. Of course, the reference of a work as femme sans tête, or woman without a head, makes you wonder which painting she's referring to. Could it be one of these femme maisons? And it certainly evokes Ernst's first surrealist collage novel, titled La Femme sans tête. It's a play on words, woman with 100 heads or woman without a head. It can be read either way or understood either way. The headless figures in Bourgeois' paintings appear both vulnerable and menacing. A number of other paintings by Bourgeois might fall into the category of the headless figure. Key among these are Portrait from 1944, which you'll see on the left and is in the exhibition, as well as this work, Pole of Joy, which its location is no longer known at the moment. Portrait 1944 offers a full body representation of the artist. Dark strokes of paint extend out from the center of where the figure's face should appear. Rudimentary white dots and dashes concentrated at the center of this dynamic, if formless, non-head indicate rudimentary eyes, nose, and a mouth. Notably, the figure's contrapposto and the position of her feet recall one of the 2 postures of the Vitruvian Man, a pose that appears in other works by Bourgeois from the period. A similarly headless figure, Pole of Joy, is another example. And as is this, Roof Song, in which the figure's face is present only by way of distortion. It is not only the headless nature of the acéphale that connects it to Bourgeois' painting of the headless woman. In contrast to the emphatically vertical nature of the femme maison paintings, Bourgeois created at least 2 paintings of a horizontal or fallen femme maison, which recall Bataille's description of the acéphale's origin in the seemingly regressive movement between the vertical human to the horizontal bestial. Notably, art historian Mignon Nixon contains Bataille's related concept of the œil sexe, or genital eye, to the motif of the femme maison, in which, quote, the female figure's gaze is displaced cartoonishly to its sex. While that sounds a bit abstract right now, if you go take a look at them, I think you'll understand what I'm saying. In an untitled painting from 1946, the figure of a headless woman overlaid with a building appears on her hands and knees, a sort of animalistic pose that suggests humiliation and abjection. A drawing depicting a similar motif heightens the latter through the addition of a plant-like form that sprouts cheerfully from the figure's backside. In Fallen Woman, a hybrid figure appears to dive helpless, limbless, and face forward toward the ground. In these works and others, Bourgeois mapped contrasting states of mind onto vertical and horizontal orientations. In an interview from 1992, Bourgeois explained the significance of these two orientations in her work, saying, Horizontality is a desire to give up, to sleep, and be passive, to retreat. Verticality is affirmation, an attempt at a peaceful compromise and a desire for acceptance. Hanging and floating are states of ambivalence and doubt. Even without a knowledge of Bataille's work, these correspondences are, in a way, accessible to us, almost intuitive, in that they follow the tendency of both the French and English languages to align literal and metaphoric uprightness with control, probity, and calm, whereas lying down or falling is associated with failure and social censure. Bourgeois referred to the works in oil that she produced during her first years in New York as nostalgia pictures. The art historian Bryony Fair, who contributed to this exhibition's catalog, understands the term not just as a commentary on subject matter, but also a mode of working, that is, looking back in order to move forward. In this sense, writes Fair, Bourgeois was an ambivalent modernist. The great meta-narrative of modernity, with its origins in a Renaissance imaginary, appeared increasingly suspect to Bourgeois and many of her contemporaries faced with the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe and the Soviet Union in the early 20th century, and the eventual outbreak of a devastating and all-consuming world war. Yet it was through an engagement with the past that Bourgeois sought an escape from the status quo of the present, including the dictates of an emerging rhetoric of abstract painting that would dominate the New York scene for years. If today the artist is best known as a sculptor, whose work often challenged or complicated deeply rooted formal and conceptual conventions of modernist practice, this approach might be said to find its roots in her early experiments in the quintessentially Renaissance and modernist medium of painting. In 1986, Bourgeois claimed, "My work has to do with the testing of authority, emotional authority symbolized by geometry. That the God that failed," unquote. As I've hoped to demonstrate, this approach can be traced to the artist's earliest mature work, a body of painting produced between 1938 and 1949. In some ways, Bourgeois' quarrel with the authority of intellectual and artistic traditions for representing three-dimensional space or the real world was linked to a broader set of formal questions regarding how the collective understands and communicates a shared sense of reality. The cryptic visual lexicon that Bourgeois established first in painting would continue to inform her practice for decades to come. Both familiar and strange, the elements of this lexicon continue to mutate, resisting the demand for a stable meaning and the inscription of discursive difference writ large. Likewise, in undercutting Renaissance conventions for describing and representing the natural world and built environment, her paintings offer an implicit argument against logocentrism, or the drive for symbolization, for meaning. Around 1949, this approach seemed to necessitate moving away from the canvas, a space sacred to the Renaissance and modernist meaning-making, and into an encounter with the three-dimensional world. I've been struck writing this paper at how close we seem to be to that moment that she was operating in the 40s. And that's the end of the paper. Thank you.
What I wonder about is, I know she was a little before some of the women artists of the 60s, but did she have any alliances with, Nevelson or Frankenthaler or any of those people? You know, any of the women that were, like I say, more of the 60s, 50s, 60s era, where she would have actually been so much older than they were at that time.
Maggie is a great expert on this, but I know that she knew Nevelson. She was also, clearly aware of a number of other women artists working at the time and participated in a show called The Women, organized by Peggy Guggenheim, and I'm forgetting the exact date on that, but sometime in the 40s. I'm not sure what kinds of relationships she had. I know that she was at times friendly and at times somewhat territorial, but she was, operating in a field which was almost, which wasn't very much dominated by men. She also knew Hedda Stern, I believe, and so there are those friendships. How they come into play is a much more complicated answer, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. A couple times you indicated that she was kind of making a few jokes with some of her work, that she had a little bit of a twist to the way that she would approach things. Could you speak a little bit more on how humor influenced her work?
Sure. Well, I think to put humor in art historical context, that's a very important part of the Surrealist project. Word games, just games in general, dark, and she had a very, I'd say, dark, wry sense of humor. And so you'll often find in her paintings a combination of a dark sense of humor and also a sense of, sort of threat, or there's something ominous, but at the same time there's something almost silly happening. So it's an interesting tension that she is often playing with. Let me think of some examples. I mean, there are these sort of some of the figures, these abstract figures, look at times really ridiculous, or maybe even erotic, or very precarious, like they're about to fall over, clownish, but at the same time they can easily morph into these, really sort of overwhelming figures, like the spider, Maman spider. So I think it's something that she's playing with a lot in the work. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that she was taken up as an icon of second wave feminism. I'm very ignorant about most aspects of her life, but I'm curious about whether she ever expressed ideas that would be consistent with that movement. And just to pick an example, the housewife paintings could be interpreted as wow, this is a big conflict for women who are trapped by these home duties and prevented from doing their own thing. And then the presentation of the genital theme as being trapped by this house. I mean, I would not. To me, that those are not erotic paintings. To me, it says frustration or something. But I don't know if that's what she meant from it. And was there anything? Did she write or say anything that would clarify any of these themes?
Thank you for that question. Actually, other scholars have pointed out that she, the title Femme Maison was added later to these paintings, I believe sometime in the 60s. So they're not original to the paintings, and yet they also predate the moment where they're taken up by this second wave feminist movement. I think perhaps what these women were drawn to in the works was precisely what you're pointing out, a kind of way in which the body and the being of a woman and the sort of domestic space can also almost feel sort of claustrophobically merged or grafted onto one another in a way that's prison-like or difficult. But they also reference, they're clearly in conversation with things like the surrealist exquisite corpse games where you draw a head and then the next person, without seeing what you drew, draws a body. So I think that they are more than this sort of what they became for that movement, but they were also a very powerful symbol for that moment in the 70s. And as for Bourgeois' own, I think, relationship to feminism per se, I think, she, in many ways, she is prefiguring a lot of the concerns and a lot of the sort of tensions that are at the crux of that movement. But she's also, coming out from a time that precedes that. And so I'm not sure if she ever, would have identified herself seamlessly as, yes, this is who I am. I think she always, as with everything else, probably had a somewhat ambivalent relationship to that category as well. At the same time, she was very, she participated in events that were related to that movement and things. So, as usual, an ambivalent, somewhat ambivalent response.
Hello. So I'm kind of stuck on the fact that she had a practice of painting and then quit the practice of painting. And I'm wondering if anything else in her life coincided with the beginning and end of that regarding her relationships, her living situation, her job as a mother, because it's such a bizarre thing to bracket such a powerful medium, like to start it and then stop it. But a lot of times an artist works in a certain medium when it's sort of situational. Yeah. So was there anything that happened in 1949, like a move or I don't know, the kids grew up and she could finally make big sculptures, or someone left home, or was there anything like that?
Yeah, that's sort of the unanswered question. I think I went into this exhibition thinking that there might be an answer to the question. I think there's sort of multiple possible answers. I think that it's true that she was not interested in the rhetoric of painting that was really firming up almost into an ideology or sort of a dogma at that point in New York. Greenbergian modernism. But she also had begun in the mid-40s experimenting a lot with sculpture, with print. And you can see the way in which her painting is, even in her references to these Renaissance treatises, from the beginning, very, very invested and interested in the idea of how do you represent space? What are the conventions for representing space? And it almost seems as if she needed to work through that, as a painterly tradition first, and then it before moving into three-dimensional space, so to speak, with the sculptures. But and she would continue to draw and paint in some watercolors and not the sort of oil paint medium that you see here throughout her life. So it remains a question that I'm not sure has been answered, but it's also, I think, there's different ways of kind of understanding how that might have happened. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Do you know what she thought about Greenberg? Did she ever meet him? Did she hate him?
She had a lot of thoughts about a lot of people. I don't remember seeing in the notes any specific comments she made about Greenberg, but you might find some if you dig hard enough. I know that she did feel very, as a woman at the time, feel quite, she was at the center of things in many ways, but always at the periphery. And I know that that may have contributed to this feeling of, outsiderness as well. And 1949, her father would die, and I'm hesitant to go to biographical, sort of information to explain things in terms of practice, but in 1951, her father passed away. It was a big shift for her, and she stopped working altogether for a while. So when she came back, there wasn't any painting after that. But the last painting that I know of hers is from '49, so it's not the timeline doesn't exactly match up.
I believe that is our time for Q&A. So a big thank you to Claire and to everyone for participating. So now is our opportunity where we would love to invite you to go up to the second floor to view the exhibition. If you would like, you can go back through the main entrance into the Great Hall, where there are stairs leading up to the second floor. We also have some staff that are happy to help direct y'all to the elevators. Also in the Great Hall, the NOMA shop has a pop-up where catalogs are available for sale. So thank you all again for coming today, and again, thank you to Claire for this really wonderful program.
Thank you.